baseball.
This is a simple game. You throw the ball, you hit the ball, you catch the ball.
A game rich in history and tradition. And
you lollygag the ball around the infield. You lollygag your way down to first. You lollygag in and out of the dugout.
a game that gets a little bit weird.
You know what that makes you, Larry? Lollygaggers. Lollygaggers.
This is the Lollygaggers Podcast. Now here's your host, Chris Bull Brom.
Oh, well, excuse me for having an opinion, pal.
Welcome, one and all baseball fans alike, ladies and germs, to episode 2 of the Lollygaggers Podcast. I'm Chris Bull Brom, your host, and if you're new to the show, welcome. If you're not new to the show, that means you've been here for a whole week, because this is episode number 2. But for those of you who don't know, the Lollygaggers Podcast is a weekly show that focuses on the history of America's pastime. It's all about the game of baseball. We dive into the weird, unique stories and legends and unbreakable records, once-in-a-lifetime performances, all that cool stuff, and a whole lot more. We'll feature occasional interviews with guests from all walks of baseball life, whether it's current or former players, coaches, broadcasters. We'll talk about their love of the game, why they got into whatever aspect it was, whether they decided to be a player or wanted to be a coach, or how they got into broadcasting. And then we'll talk about some of their own unique experiences and have them share some of their own stories surrounding the game of baseball. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, that's what this show is all about, is the stories of baseball. A game rich in history, rich in tradition, and rich in stories, whether they're heartfelt or unique or funny or just downright weird. There are so many storylines that permeate the game of baseball at a variety of levels, and that's what it's all about here on the Lollygaggers Podcast. And this week, we're going to begin our descent into the legendary history of baseball. And when I say legendary, I mean legendary, because this week we're talking about the curse of the Bambino. But before we get into that, if your business or organization would like to sponsor the Lollygaggers Podcast, well, don't be afraid to reach out and let us know. You can shoot me an email at thelollyaggerspodcast@gmail.com. And be sure to check us out on all the social medias, The Lollygaggers Podcast on Facebook and at lollygagger_pod on the Twitter sphere.
The one constant through all the years, Ray, has been baseball. America has rolled by like an army of steamrollers. It's been erased like a blackboard, rebuilt and erased again. But baseball has marked the time.
Once again, this is the Lollygaggers Podcast. I'm Chris Bull Brom, your host, and I guarantee you when you ask a non-baseball fan to name one baseball player throughout the game's history, I would say 90% or more, maybe even closer to 95, 96% of people are going to say Babe Ruth.
The Sultan of SWAT.
The King of Crash.
The Colossus of Clout.
The Colossus of Clout.
Babe Ruth! The Great Bambino!
I mean, despite the generations of talent that have made their mark on the history of baseball, none of them are as synonymous with the game as Babe Ruth. He's literally the walking embodiment of the man, the myth, the legend. From stories of his antics on the field, like his called shot to center field, did he actually, call a home run at Wrigley Field before he hit one? The world may never know, and quite honestly, we don't need to know, right? That's part of the legend. To stories of his antics off the field, to, of course, his record-setting career. Nobody, very few, I should say, have had the staying power within the game of baseball as George Herman Ruth. I mean, he was one of the first 5 guys elected to the Baseball Hall of Fame. He was part of the first 5. And still to this day, people talk about Babe Ruth and compare him to Shohei Ohtani nowadays. I mean, they compare him to players of now, or compare players now to the antics of George Herman Ruth in his heyday. So not many people have been able to stick around with the game of baseball the way Babe Ruth has. And perhaps the biggest mystery surrounding the Babe is the curse of the Bambino. Again, it's a phrase that's well known. throughout baseball, even the most casual baseball fan is familiar with the curse of the Bambino, right? And most people know the gist. The Red Sox agree to sell their star player to the Yankees, thus cursing the Red Sox to nearly a century of mediocrity, heartbreaking postseason losses, and just all-around meh baseball. But why? Why would you sell a superstar like Babe Ruth to a league rival and, basically start them on the path to domination as a baseball organization while miring yourself in this need for relevancy? I mean, quite honestly, the Red Sox were clinging to being a relevant organization at times after the sale of Babe Ruth. And it feels almost like self-sabotage when you look at it. It's like, man, did they do that on purpose? Is it literally shooting yourself in the foot? Did you cut your nose off to spite your face? Well, maybe. There's a lot to the story, and we're going to unpack it all.
Picture it, Sicily, 1852.
Close, but not quite. It was actually Baltimore, Maryland, February 1895, not Sicily, 1852, but, it was close. George Herman Ruth Jr. was born to parents George Ruth Sr. and Kate Ruth. Now, one of 8 children, George Jr. and his sister Mamie were actually the only 2 kids who survived to see adulthood because the Ruth parents worked extremely long hours every single day to help make ends meet, as many people did back in the late 1800s. George was often left unsupervised and to his own devices. And like many a small lad, trust me, I was one myself, without someone to watch over him, George Herman became a bit, let's say, unruly. He would often skip school, cause trouble around the neighborhood, get in trouble with the neighbors. And so when he turned 7, his parents decided, you know what, we need a little stricter environment, an environment that, quite honestly, they couldn't provide, working as much as they were. So they sent him to St. Mary's Industrial School for Boys. And it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a school run by a brotherhood of laymen from an order of the Xaverian Brothers, a Roman Catholic religious institute dedicated to education, named after St. Francis Xavier and founded back in 1839. So the school had been around for the better part of 60 years by the time that George Herman Ruth showed up as a student, and they taught him vocational skills and life skills. But in addition to that strict regiment that he needed, he also discovered his passion and love for the game of baseball. And this is where Brother Matthias enters the picture. And if you're wondering who Brother Matthias was, he was one of the laymen at St. Mary's. And he kind of took George Herman Ruth Jr. under his wing and became a positive role model and a father-like figure for the boy. Brother Matthias was also responsible for refining George's baseball skills. He was very talented at a young age, but certainly not refined in a variety of ways. Upon discovering his love of the game, Matthias worked tirelessly with George on hitting and fielding and pitching. And eventually, as he refined those skills and got better and better, it became evident to everyone at St. Mary's that George Herman Ruth Jr. had a gift. He was some kind of special when it came to the game of baseball. In fact, he became so good that the brothers at St. Mary's invited the owner of the Baltimore Orioles, Jack Dunn, to come watch George play. And it took less than an hour of Dunn watching George for Dunn to realize how impressive this young man was, and they offered him a contract to play for the Baltimore Orioles in February of 1914. Now, here's what's crazy. Because George was only 19 at the time, Dunn had to become George's legal guardian in order to validate the contract. Surprisingly, at 19 years old, he wasn't old enough to enter a contract on his own. Now, again, this is the late 1800s, well, it was the early 1900s when he signed the contract. They had no problem sending kids in their early teens out to work in various forms to help support the family. And, we're talking about getting closer and closer to the roaring 20s and eventually, things like the Depression. And so it's a little surprising that at 19 years old, Jack Dunn had to become George Herman Ruth's legal guardian in order for him to validate the contract. But that's how it was. So that's how it went down. But as soon as George joined the Baltimore Baseball Club and all the other players saw him for the first time, they started referring to him as Jack's newest babe. And thus, the most famous nickname in American sports history was born. Yeah, you didn't think his actual name was Babe Ruth, right? No, George Herman Ruth Jr. had officially become the Babe.
Yeah, she even signed her name on it. Some lady named Ruth. Baby Ruth.
Now we fast forward a few short months to July of 1914. Now keep in mind, he signed this contract to play for the Orioles in February of 1914. By July of 1914, Babe Ruth had performed well enough in a brief audition with Jack Dunn and the Orioles that Dunn sold Ruth to the Boston Red Sox. Now, you're probably thinking to yourself, why the hell would the Orioles sign him to a contract? And if he was as talented as it seemed, then turn around and sell him to another team just a few months later. Here's the kicker. At the time, the Baltimore Orioles, who we all know now as a big league ball club, was actually a minor league team at the time, and they were basically a farm team for the Red Sox. Their job was to find, sign, grow, groom talent for the Red Sox organization. So the Baltimore Orioles actually started essentially as a farm team for the Red Sox, then eventually became a major league ball club there in Baltimore. But that was the case in 1914. George Herman Ruth, a.k.a. the Babe, played for the Baltimore Orioles, the minor league team, and then was sold to the Boston Red Sox. His contract was sold. So basically, Dunn was just doing his job. He found a diamond in the rough, polished it up a little bit, sent it on to the big league club. I don't think even he knew how truly special the talent he discovered really was. And I hear people talk about it, and quite honestly, I fall in this camp as well. People talk about, would Babe Ruth be as good a ball player in today's game as he was back in, the 19 teens and the 1920s? No, if you took Babe Ruth from then and put him in today's game, no, he would not be as good a ball player as he was. But that's the difference, right? He was a product of the game of that era. He was a guy that stood above everybody else from that era of baseball, much like a Shohei Ohtani now, who's without a doubt the most electric two-way player in the game of baseball. He's a top-tier pitcher and a phenomenal hitter, and he's doing things in the game of baseball that have not been done since the days of Babe Ruth, when guys pitched and hit exceptionally well. It's just two different eras of baseball, and people have evolved accordingly. And I think if you took Babe Ruth and evolved him to the game of baseball now versus when he played against guys who were basically doing it as a part-time job, or had part-time jobs to, bolster their salary for playing baseball, then yeah, I think without a doubt, he's equally as good as he was back then. But you can't, consider inflation for human performance, right? It's not like money where you talk about $10,000 in 1914 versus $10,000 in 2023. You can't do that with human performance. So there's no way of saying, oh, well, if Babe Ruth, had evolved into this, then that's what would happen. But I digress. So basically what I'm getting at is very talented guy, so much so beyond anything that anybody had really seen. Obviously, most baseball and even non-baseball fans know Babe Ruth for his prodigious power, right? He was the Sultan of SWAT, the Colossus of Clout, essentially invented, for lack of a better term, the home run, because really not many guys before him hit the ball with the kind of power that Babe Ruth possessed. That was his calling card, is he hit the ball exceptionally far. But he actually started his career as a pitcher, and he was a damn good pitcher at that. In 1914, Babe appeared in 5 games for the Boston Red Sox. He pitched in 4 of those. He was the winning pitcher in his major league debut on July 11th, 1914. But unfortunately for Babe Ruth, no amount of talent could keep him on the big league club because there was a bunch of other talent on the roster that was blocking his way. Eventually, he was optioned to the minor leagues because of a stacked big league roster. So even the greatest ball player of a generation had to pay his dues in the minor leagues until some of the seasoned vets left and made room on the roster for him. By 1915, a year later, Babe Ruth, however, was a permanent fixture in the Boston rotation, and he got better and better every year on the mound, which is crazy to think about, again, because we're talking about a guy who for the longest time was the home run king, right? He was the most feared power hitter in all of baseball. But in 1916, he went 23-12 and led the league with an ERA of 1.75, which for baseball fans, you're like, holy cow. 1.75 ERA, that's insane. For non-baseball fans, first of all, I'm glad you're listening if you're a non-baseball fan. But second of all, ERA is earned run average. Basically, how many runs a pitcher allows over the course of the innings they pitch. And anything under 2 is phenomenal. That's otherworldly. 2 to 3 is outstanding. 3 to 3.5 is just really good. Anything under 2, there's a small group of people that can pitch an entire season and have an ERA under 2. Now, the following year, his ERA did go up, ballooned up to a staggering 2.01. Yeah, I know. Right? Just an off year for sure. Finished with a 24-13 record in 1917. However, the most impressive feat from that 1917 season wasn't the 2.01 ERA. It wasn't the 24-13 record. It was 35 complete games in 38 starts. First of all, guys don't throw 35 ball games anymore. That's almost unheard of for a starting pitcher to get 35 starts in a season. But 38 starts for Babe Ruth, and 35 of those were complete games. Just 3 times in those 38 starts did he not finish a ball game. He was basically a baseball machine at that point. He was like a Terminator sent back in time to destroy the old ways of the game and usher in a new era of baseball. You know what? Somebody call Hollywood, because I think we've got a pitch for a new movie here. Baseball Terminator. We're going to make millions.
Babe Ruth is the greatest baseball player that ever lived. I mean, people say he was less than a god, but more than a man. You know, like Hercules or something.
But anyway, here's the deal. As good as Babe was on the mound, he displayed enormous power potential at the plate when given the opportunity, as we all know. So much so that the Red Sox decided they couldn't keep his bat out of the lineup anymore. They're like, you know what? We got to find a way to get this guy hitting the baseball regularly. So in 1918, they began the transition of turning Babe Ruth into an everyday player, becoming the first truly dominant two-way player the game had ever seen. In 1918, he tied for the major league lead in home runs with, get this, 11. It was a completely different era of baseball. But yeah, he was tied for the league lead in home runs with 11 in 1918. And you're thinking, boy, he had to have played a long time if he hit 11 home runs a season. And that's not the case. In 1919, he actually set a new single-season home run with 29 home runs. And little did he or anybody else know at the time, but those would be the last home runs he would ever hit in a Red Sox uniform. As during that stretch, the Red Stockings won 3 of their first 5 World Series championships with Babe Ruth on the roster. They'd already won 2. Babe Ruth comes along. They win 3 more. Boston was basically baseball royalty at the time, right? They had won the first modern World Series back in 1903 and won 5 of the first World Series, or 5 of the first 15 World Series titles. In 1918, when they won the World Series, Babe Ruth was the winning pitcher in 2 of the 6 games in the World Series that year. And it was that performance, actually. It was that years worth of work plus what he did in the postseason that really buoyed Babe's confidence. And so he showed up late to spring training the following year in 1919. Now, keep in mind, 1919 was the year he set the record for most home runs in a season with 29. But he came into spring training in 1919. He came in late and demanded a raise from Red Sox owner Harry Frazee. And eventually, Ruth and Frazee negotiated out a 3-year, $27,000 contract, which at the time was, that was big money. So they signed this contract, 3 years, $27,000. And in 1919, the Boston Red Sox went on to win nothing. Absolutely zilch. They finished 6th in the American League in 1919. But because at that point, Babe Ruth had kind of become larger than life. He was a budding superstar at the time. That didn't stop the great Bambino from trying to renegotiate his contract again. He went, yeah, you know what? This $10,000 a year is nice, but I think I deserve $20,000 a year. He wanted to double his salary.
Show me the money.
And see, that's where the problem started. Harry Frazee wasn't really rolling in money. In fact, this dude was a theater producer and a director who, interestingly enough, was from New York, but came to Boston when he bought the Sox in 1916. A coincidence? I don't know. Conspiracy theory, perhaps. So when he bought the Red Sox in 1916, he went into immense debt. And on top of that, Frazee needed a little cash to finance his latest play named My Lady Friends, which would eventually go on to become the successful Broadway hit No No Nanette. So what do you do when you're swimming in debt and you've got a fix that you need and you can't fund those passions and obsessions? You sell off your prized possessions, right? You go pawn something off to make a little extra cash. And that's exactly what Harry Frazee did. But instead of, pawning off his Rolex or his wife's grandmother's wedding ring, he decided to pawn off perhaps the biggest star in the game of baseball. Now, some will argue that Frazee sold Ruth's contract to the Yankees to help fund his latest Broadway aspirations. Others will say, no, that didn't fund No No Nanette and make it a Broadway success. They'll say that he sold the contract because he didn't agree with Babe's demand to be paid $20,000 a year instead of $10,000 a year. And so in a show of power, he decides to sell Babe Ruth's contract as if to say, you know what, I'm the owner and I'll do what I want. Now, others say that it was a way for him to get out from underneath a contract he couldn't really afford to begin with and kind of help make up some of that debt that he was up to his eyeballs in from buying the Red Sox. But according to Frazee himself, and again, we'll never really know the real reason behind it, but according to Frazee, he was unhappy with the fact that despite Babe Ruth's record-setting performance at the plate, his team still finished a distant 6th in an 8-team American League. Again, they were only better than 2 other teams in the American League, and those teams were not good. Whatever the reason may be, whatever it is, Harry Frazee in November of 1919 agreed to sell the game's biggest star to a league rival, the New York Yankees, for a total sum of $100,000 to be paid in 4 $25,000 installments. And for those of you keeping track at home, $100,000 in 1919 is the equivalent in purchasing power to about $1,753,543.35 here in 2023. So, show me the money! Yeah, at the time of the sale, the New York Yankees had never even made an appearance in the World Series. And again, remember, the Red Sox had won 5 of the first 15 World Series titles and 4 in the previous 6 years between 1912 and 1918. So they were the cream of the crop, right? They were the Boston Red Sox. Meanwhile, it was, oh, yeah, that's cute. They're the New York Yankees, but they really haven't done much. But in 1918, that would be the last time the Red Sox would celebrate as world champions for 86 years. The curse of the Bambino was officially born. The New York Yankees would go on to win 4 World Series titles with Babe Ruth on their roster, and then go on to win 22 more World Series before the close of the 20th century. That's 26 World Series titles. And if you ever forget how many the Yankees have won, just ask any Yankees fan. It's sort of like asking somebody who does CrossFit. I'd be more than happy to tell you everything about how many World Series the Yankees have won over the years. It's 26, by the way. And again, 4 of those came with the best power hitter in the history of the game at the time, Babe Ruth, who had really cemented himself as a threat at the plate with the New York Yankees. But all of that aside, as the Yankees ascended, the Red Sox descended. They plunged into a decades-long abyss of mediocrity. Even when they made World Series appearances, it would end in heartbreaking and downright eerie circumstances, and that just bolstered the whole curse narrative, right? I mean, anytime something crazy happens, like a ground ball between somebody's legs at first base.
Little roller up along first, behind the bag. It gets through Buckner. Here comes Knight, and the Mets win it.
People start to really buy into the whole curse of the Bambino thing. In fact, in the 84 seasons after the Ruth sale, the Sox reached the World Series 4 times in 1946, 1967, 1975, and 1986. You do the math, there's big gaps there, right? Each one of those they lost in the 7th and final game. And again, many of them in heartbreaking and ridiculous fashion. Nobody wanted the curse to be real more than, say, Bill Buckner, whose costly error you just heard in Game 6 of the 86 World Series allowed the Mets to win Game 6, force Game 7, which they would also win, and prevent the Red Sox from breaking the curse back in 1986. That image of the ball going between Bill Buckner's legs behind first base was sort of the shining example of what haunted Red Sox fans for generations.
The Red Sox never let you down. Huh? That's right. Why? Because they haven't won a World Series in a century or so? So what? They're here. Every April, they're here. At 1:05 or at 7:05, there is a game. If it gets rained out, guess what? They make it up to you. Does anyone else in your life do that?
So, how did the boys in Boston finally break the curse? That's a really good question. No, nobody really knows the answer. Now, according to the movie Fever Pitch, it was because Jimmy Fallon's character Ben and Drew Barrymore's character Lindsay got back together at the end of the movie, and Lindsay refused to let Ben sell his season tickets at Fenway Park because people were like his family, and she fell in love with the Red Sox as much as she did with Ben, and that's just silly, right? Unless it's not. Maybe that movie's based on a true story that we didn't know about. Conspiracy theories. Now, maybe somebody cut the head off a live rooster, you know. Oh, wait, that was Bull Durham and the glove. But at one point, I know Boston fans even staged an exorcism outside Fenway Park. They were like, "Be gone, green monster, be gone." Some even think Johnny Damon's hair had something to do with it, because apparently the more ridiculous the theory, the more logical it becomes, kind of like conspiracy theories. But whatever they did, it obviously worked. Because in 2004, the Boston Red Sox and their hated rivals from New York were once again meeting in the postseason. And like so many times before in the last 80-some years, the Yankees dominated their way to a 3-game-to-none lead in the best-of-7 American League Championship Series. And this is where, for Sox fans, the writing was on the wall, right? It was like, here we go again. We're doomed. The Yankees are our baseball overlords. We are but their humble servants. And then something happened. A late stolen base in game number 4, a clutch base hit, Red Sox stave off elimination. Then they go on to win game 5. And then next thing you know, they win game 6. And bingo, bango, bongo, game 7. And all of a sudden, they become the first team to ever overcome a 3-0 deficit in a championship series to punch their ticket to the World Series. Honestly, at that point, it didn't matter who they played in the World Series. The curse was broken the minute they beat the Yankees in the best-of-7 ALCS, came back from down 3-0 to win that series. That's when Boston fans said, nope, curse is broken. Don't care who we're playing. Bingo, we got this. And sure enough, they swept the Cardinals in 4 games. Then just 3 years later, the Sox would beat the Rockies in the 2007 World Series. Colorado's only World Series appearance, by the way. And then they would win it all again in 2013 and again in 2018, defeating the Cardinals again and the Dodgers, respectively. So within a decade, the Boston Red Sox went from being an also-ran. They went from being a running joke for many, many years. They went from being a victim of a supposed curse of the Bambino to being the belle of the ball. They went to being baseball royalty again. And everyone in Beantown pretty much forgot that the curse that had plagued them for them and their ancestors for the better part of a century even existed. Because here's what we know about baseball fans. We can quickly forget how bad things were when they start to go our way.
I never doubted you for a second. Wonderful.
And there you have it. There it is. That's the story behind the curse of the Bambino. How one ill-advised decision changed the landscape of not one, but 2 franchises. And the story of how Jimmy Fallon and Drew Barrymore saved the day. No, wait, that's... One of these days, I'll get that conspiracy theory to catch on.
You gotta tell me, wait, the outfield, the grass is spongy?
Ben, focus.
Sorry.
Oh, and one final note, just because why not? The New York Yankees, who again have 26 World Series titles, ask anybody, they'll tell you, they've not won a World Series since 2009. So, who knows? Maybe we got another curse brewing. Join us next time on the Lollygaggers podcast as we explore the worst team in the history of Major League Baseball, the 1899 Cleveland Spiders. A team so bad they ceased to exist after 1899. Be sure to like and follow the Lollygaggers podcast on your favorite podcast listening platform. Join us on social media by liking the Lollygaggers podcast on Facebook. Follow at @lollygagger_pod on Twitter. And if you want to share your thoughts, opinions, or ideas for future shows, shoot me an email at thelollyaggerspodcast@gmail.com. And again, if your business or organization is interested in sponsoring the Lollygaggers podcast, reach out to us, let us know, message us on those social medias, or email again the lollygaggerspodcast@gmail.com. And until we meet again, remember,
there's heroes and there's legends. Heroes get remembered, but legends never die.
This has been the Lollygaggers podcast. I'm Chris Bull-Brom. Thanks for tuning in.
That's all. We got one hit.
You can't say on the air.
Don't worry, nobody's listening anyway.